All right, so now let's quickly go ahead and look at our composition pattern. So with React composition pattern, it allows us to have a certain functionality of code in a component, and so that we can actually be able to reuse that component in different components, or in multiple components rather. So in this case, for my input element, I'm going to wrap this input element with a component, right? So that I will have different styling for my inputs. All right, so to do that, let's just quickly go ahead and create a new folder under components called raw. Right, so inside this raw folder, I'm going to create a new file called input raw.js. Right, so inside this input raw.js, I'm going to create a function-based component, right? And let me just quickly get this out of the way. Right, so I'll export my input raw, right? And I want to make this an arrow function. So let's quickly do that. Right, so now we have our functional component as an arrow function. All right, so what we're going to do is with React composition, what we are going to do is we are going to wrap this input element, right, with our input raw. Right, so what composition patterns is, it allows us, it takes some props, right? So what these props will be is, these props, it takes the props as the children. So in this case, I can actually go ahead and say props dot children, right? So which means what this does is it allows us to actually go ahead and display all the children that will be wrapped with the input raw. So in this case, let me just quickly go ahead and save this, right? And I move back to my register user, and let me quickly go ahead and bring in my input raw, right? So that we can actually go ahead and use our composition. So in this case, let me say import input raw from raw, right? / input raw, like so, right? So how we are going to achieve this is we are going to wrap, right, this element. So let me simply go ahead and say input raw, right, like so. So just think of composition pattern as inheritance, if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, where we can actually have some certain functionality, we can have access to some certain functionality that will be in this input raw. So in terms of our components, we are simply going to style, instead of styling my input raw here, I'm going to style my input elements in here, which means all the styles and all the validators that I need to put, I'm going to put them in this input raw. So in this case, let's just quickly go ahead and test this out. So one thing that I need to add here is I also need to add a placeholder. So in this case, the placeholder is going to be name, right? So we are going to have multiple input elements, for example, for the name, surname, email, username and password, and confirm password as well. So in the meantime, right now I've added one input element. So let's quickly go ahead and save this and test our code out, right? So let's simply go ahead and navigate to our Chrome and refresh our browser. So as you can see, I now have my input element, right? And my input element field is still working as desired, right? So which means there's nothing wrong with our composition so far, right? So let's go back to terminal, right? So what we're going to do is, for all the styles that I'm going to do, right, I'm going to put them in here, right? So one thing that you have to note is with composition pattern, so like for example, I can simply go ahead and style this div, right? So in this case, let me simply go ahead and say style, right? So this div, I'm going to style it with a container, right? So which means I need to put the style here. So I can say const container, then I'll put my object here, right? So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to say display, right? Display flex, and also I'm simply going to say flex direction, right? So for my flex direction is going to be column, The reason why I'm putting it as a column, because I want to be actually to have a label on my input element. So, and then I'll put, let's say, a padding of 10 pixels, right? So with this style that I've done is it's just some styling that I'm doing in my input row, but this style will be also affected in this row element, since we're using composition, right? So let's go back to our input row. Right, so the next thing that I probably need is I probably need a label. So before I put a label, let's talk a little bit more about this props.children or this composition pattern. So what I'm going to do is I can have multiple elements inside my input row. So let's say I can have, let's say, a p tag, right? Then I can say another, let's say I can say another element, right? I can say another element, okay, another element, right? Then let me simply go ahead and copy this, right? And I'll paste it a couple of times, right? So I can have multiple elements, right? So let me simply go ahead and go to my Google Chrome and I refresh the page, right? So as you can see, I now have my all my elements. So all these elements that are being displayed are the children, the elements that are coming from the props.children in my input row. So if I go to the input row where I'm saying props.children, so as long as I'm inputting elements inside my input row, those elements will be displayed as the children. So this props.children is actually a children's API that allows us to perform our composition in a nice and easier way. Right, so in this case, what I want to have is for my input row, I want actually to be able to have a validator where I'm actually saying that for my input row, I want it to actually take exactly one input element. I don't want to take different elements. For example, I don't want to take div tags or paragraph tags or any other HTML element here. I want it to take only an input element. Right, so the children's API comes with React comes with a children API that we can use, right? So in this case, I can actually go ahead and bring the children right here, right? So what this children API does is it allows us to perform some certain functionality in terms of displaying our data here, or in terms of handling the children that will be passed as props in our element, right? So let's simply go ahead and use the children's API. So in this case, let's say I want to display only one element, so I don't want it to display multiple elements. I can simply go ahead and use the children API. So the children API comes with an only element. So if I say children dot, you can actually see that the children API comes with certain helper functions. For example, it has the map, it has the only, it has the to array, the for each, and the count, right? So in this case, if I want this input row to accept one element, I will say only, right? Which means I'm expecting I'm actually expecting my input row to accept only one child. So let me simply go ahead and say props dot children, like so. So it's small letter C. Props.children, right? So right now I'm doing some kind of validation, right? So in this case, I've inputted multiple elements. So this is now 4 elements, but in this case, I wanted to have one element. So the way you validate it is you use the only helper method inside the children API. So let's simply go ahead and go back to our browser, right? And refresh. Right, so as you can see, our app, yes, our app breaks, right? So the reason why our app is breaking, so if we go to the console, right, you can actually see that it's saying the React children only expect to receive a single child, right? So this is one of the validations that we want, right? So which means we want our user that is going to be use our package or our API, in this case our composition input row component, to actually be able to pass only a single element, right? So for our validation, this checks in, right? So let's simply go back to our input row, right? So in this case, the other validation that I want to be able to perform is I want to be able to pass, right? So if I go back to my input row, so I want a user to be able to pass exactly an input element, right? So which means in this case, right, so in the first validation was to pass only one element, right? So we achieved this using the only method inside the children, right? Then the next validation case that we want to verify is I want the user to be able to pass only the input element. I don't want them to pass the div tag or the paragraph tag or any other HTML element, but in this case I want them to only be able to pass the input element, right? So let me take this out, right? So in this case, okay, so let me revert it back. So let me simply go ahead and say, so the way you do it, right? So if you go to the input row, right, the input row has a helper function, sorry, the children API has a helper method that is called map, right? So we can actually go ahead and map through this. So let me simply go ahead and create our validator. So I can say say const, right? Then I can say has input element, right? I can say it has an input element. Then I can use the children API. Then I can say map, right? So what map does is it actually retains an array. So it actually goes ahead and map through our children, right? So I can say props.children, right? So I want to map through my array of children, right? And then what I want to do is for that single child, I want to be able to perform a validation. So what I want to do is for this single child that is being returned from my array of children, right? I want to say if the type of the child, so you say child dot type, so this child has a type object. So if I say child dot type, right, is equal to I can say is equal to, in this case, so the child dot types displays the type of that element. So in this case, I want it to be an input element. So I can say if child dot type is equal to input element, I want it to return true inside my array. And then else, I want it to actually go ahead and return false. So what this validator does is it actually goes ahead and check, right, if the children, or in this case the single child that we've passed, is actually an input element, right? So if it's an input element, I want this yes input to actually return an array with a true keyword, Otherwise, I want it to return an array with a false, right? So the way I can implement this functionality, right, is I can simply go ahead and say, so for this one, I can actually go ahead and pull and declare this in a variable. So what I can do is I can say const, right, and I can say single child, because it's one child that we're expecting. Then I can actually go ahead and copy this whole code, right, and then I paste this here. So this single child is the one that we want to display here, and we're also validating that very single child if it's an input element. So the way I can do it here is I can actually go ahead and for instance, I can simply go ahead and wrap this inside the div tag, right, and I want to style this div tag. So in this case, I can simply go ahead and say class name, right? So remember, in my main.css, I had a class name called styled input, right? So if I go ahead and go to resources, static css, main.css, I had a style or a class called styled input, which actually display flex, position relative, and put some padding, right? So this is the style that I'm using, and also for that style, I'm also going to style my input element, right, with the position, so that it becomes styled with the color, the background color, the radius, position, and etc. Right? So that's the input element that I am styling, right? So in this case, I can actually go ahead and put my validation here. So I can actually simply say, so remember we said this has input element returns an array with our boolean, whether it's true or false. So I can simply go ahead and say has input element, then I'll access the 0th element, right? So if this is true, right? So if this is true, if it returns true, I want it to actually go ahead and display our single child. So if it is true, I'll simply go ahead and say as display my single child. Else, I want to throw an error. So else, let me simply go ahead and say error. Then I can actually go ahead and say an input an input element is required, like so. So if the element that they've put is an input element, right? If the type of the child is an input element, I want it to actually go ahead and display that single child, or else I want it to throw an error. So let's simply go ahead and save this, right? So let's go back to our register user. So in this case, let's simply go ahead and comment this out for now. So let me simply go ahead and comment this out, because we now want to fully test our validator. So I'm commenting this out, and then it's expecting a single child. So let me put something that is not an input element. So let me put a paragraph, for example, right? So once I've done that, let's simply go back to VS Code, right, and refresh our browser. All right, so once I've refreshed the browser, you can actually see that we now have a different error, right? So the error that is firing here is saying error, an input element is required, right? So it actually means that our validation is working. So in this case, I've put a paragraph, not an input element. That's why it's complaining, right? And if I put more than 2 elements, so let's simply go ahead and revert our input element like so. Let me remove the curly braces, right? So if I revert it like so, and I leave the 2 elements as is, right? It's supposed to complain that we have passed 2 elements, yet it's expecting a single element. So let me simply go back to my Chrome, and I refresh my browser. Right, you can actually see it's now complaining about that single child. It's expecting a single child, yet you have put 2 elements. So which means our 2 validations are working. So let's simply go ahead and do it, right? So I'm removing this time, right? And let's simply go ahead and test this out, right? All right, so with our composition, you can actually see that our composition is now working. There are no more complaints from our console, and it's now displaying our single element. So as you can see right now, it's displaying our single element with a placeholder inside which says name, right? So I can say John, right? So what I now want to have is, I want my element, or I want my composition component to be able to take a label, because I want to put a label here, even though I have a placeholder, but I just want to put a label as well. So I want to put a label here. So let's quickly go ahead and look how we can actually do that. So let's jump into our VS Code, right? So in this case, right, so if I go to register user, under the input row, I want this input row to be able to take a prop as a label, right? So I'm simply going to say, for my label, in this case, let me put it as a string. For my label, I'm going to call it name, like this, for first name, right? So to actually go ahead and catch this label, React ES6, JavaScript ES6 comes with a way of destructuring our props, right? So here, what I can do, like for instance, let me simply go ahead and demonstrate what I want to do. So inside here, I want to put a label. I can actually go ahead and put a p tag here. Then I can simply go ahead and say props dot label, right? So if I say props dot label, I will now have access to this label prop that would have passed here, right? So now I have access to this props dot label, right? So if I save this, so let me just quickly go ahead and style my before I talk about destructuring, let me simply go ahead and style my label, and say, I will say label style, right, like this. And then sorry, it's label style, it's an object, right? So let me simply go ahead and copy my label style, right? And I'll say const label style, and let me simply go ahead and define my label style. So for my label, I want it to have a grayish color, so I'm simply going to say for the color it's 10108A, right? A grayish color. Then I want it to have a font, right? Weight. I remember our camel casing when it comes to our styling inside React, JSX, right? And then I want it to have a padding left of let's say 16 pixels, like so. So once I've done this, right, let's simply go ahead and test this out. So I'll go to my Chrome. I'll simply go ahead and refresh my browser. All right, so as you can see, I now have a label, right? And also I have my placeholder here, right? So I now have a label. So this is what I need. So which means the way we have passed our prop is working. So let's talk about the structuring. So to destructure our prop, we are simply going to put an object here. So instead of saying props, we simply go ahead and pull our props. So we have a children props and a label prop. So instead of saying props.children, I'll simply go ahead and remove this, and I'll say children. And for this one as well, is simply children. And for my label, instead of saying props.label, I'll use the destructured object. So we simply destructured our props from our values from our object. So this is how you destructure. So let me save and go back to browser, right? And you can actually see that our props are working as expected. So let's simply go ahead and go back to our VS Code, right? So we are now done with this input row, right? So let me close this up, right? So the next thing that we need to do is we now want to put the rest of the input elements that we are expecting in our register user, right? So for the rest of the input elements, so what I want to do is, what I want to have is, I actually want to actually be able to house this in a input in a row, right? So in a row, so what I'm simply going to do, I'm simply going to cut this out, then I'll create another div tag, right? I'll create sorry, what's going on? All right, I'll create a div tag, right? So I'll paste this out. So in this div tag, I'm going to call it a row. I'm going to style it with row, like so, because what I want to have is, I want to have my input elements side by side, right? So for my row, like for example, for my name, I can simply go ahead and copy this, right, and paste it here. So this will be the surname, right? So let's simply, for the label is going to be surname, then it's going to be a text, then for the name is surname, then for the value it's surname, then for the placeholder is surname again, right? Then this is left as is, right? So for this, let's simply go ahead and style a row. So the way we're going to style it is, we're going to say const row is equal to, so let's simply go ahead and style a row. So what I want to do in terms of styling this row, I'll simply go ahead and say display, right? Display flex, right? Then I'll simply go ahead and put the flex direction, right? Because I want it to display this side by side. So I'll say flex direction is going to be a row. Then I'll say justify content, right? Justify content, and I'll justify them to the center like this. All right, so once you've done that, for the most part, I think it's now a matter of time, a matter of importing the rest of the fields, right? So let's just simply go ahead and do it for the rest of the fields. So I now have my row for my name and my surname. So let me copy this div tag, right? So I'll put the next one will be, so we'll say name, surname, then the next one is email, right? Then the type is going to be of type email for our validation. Then here is going to be email. Then for the value is going to be email. Then for the placeholder, I will say email again, right? Then the next one is going to be perhaps username. So let's say username, right? It's going to be of type text. Then the name is going to be username, right? The value is going to be username, and then the username as well. All right, so lastly I'll put the password. So for the password, I'm simply going to say password. Then the type is going to be of type password, right? Then this is going to be of type password. The name is going to be password, right? And then the placeholder. So for the most part, we are just, so here for the label, I'm simply going to say confirm password. Then for the text, for the type, it's going to be a password type. Then for the name, it's going to be confirm underscore password. So let me copy this out for the value, and then for the placeholder, I'm simply going to say let's say password, or let me simply say confirm password, like this for the placeholder. All right, so now we have done this. The next thing, let's go ahead and test this out. All right, so now as you can see is we now have our nice form here with the placeholders and stuff like that. All right, so now we for the most part are done with our registration form. So the next thing that we want to implement here is we now want to implement a button, because I want to be actually be able to have a button here, right, that we're going to say submit and stuff like that. So let's quickly go ahead and create our button. So for our button, I'm simply going to have a div tag down below here, right? This is the one that is going to house my button. Then I want to have a style, right? So I'll say style, then button, like this. So let me simply go ahead and create the style for my button. So I'll say button is equal to this, right? So I will copy these styles, right? It's almost similar. I want it to display flex, then the flex direction, I don't need it. Then the justify content, I want to say flex, and because for my button I want it to be actually be able to be at the far right. So the last thing that I might need to add here in terms of my styling is probably the padding. So I'll say my button, we have a padding of 10 pixels. All right, so for my button, what I'm simply going to do is I'm going to create a component called button, right? So I'll put it here. So I haven't created the component yet. So to create the component, just quickly go to components, right? In the root folder, and create a component called button.js, right? So once I have this button.js in my root folder, right, let's simply go ahead and generate our functional component, right? So let me get this out of the way, right? And I'll say export button, like so. So for my button, I want it to be able to actually return a button. So I'll say button, then it's going to have a value of submit, right? And then for my style, I'm simply going to use the class name for my CSS. Remember, I had a CSS style for my button, which is btn, which gives it some nice color, some padding and stuff like that. So once I've done that, the next thing that I need to do is I'll go back to my register user and import this button. So let's simply go ahead and do that. So let's simply go ahead and say import button, right, from, then we import the button, right? So once we have imported the button, for the most part, we are done with the button, right? So the next thing that I'll probably need to do is let's go and test this out, right? So I'll go to my browser, then I'll refresh, right? So as you can see, we now have a nice button at the far right. So what I want to do is we now want to be able to handle this on submit button, so that each and every time we hit submit on our form, we want it to be able to actually go ahead and do some on submit actions. So let's simply go back to our VS Code, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an event in this form called on submit, right? So let's simply go ahead and create on submit, right? So on submit, I want it to be able to actually go ahead and run the on submit method, right? So I'll say on submit. So what I want it to do is when the user says on submit, right, I want it to actually go ahead and clear the screen, and clear my input fields, right, and at the same time push our data. So the on submit takes an event, right, and then like this. So what we want to do is, the first thing is, we don't want our page to reload, right? So to handle that is we do it by saying e.prevent default, right? So that it won't reload when each time we hit the submit button, right? So the next thing that I want to do is my validation. Remember, I had a validation, so I'm simply going to say if user password, right? So I'll simply put my simple validator here. So this is not the best way to validate your password. The way you'd want to do it is you'd want to do it on a form so that it will display. So what I'm simply going to do is if the validator works, right, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to say props, right? So if the name, sorry, yeah, I've left some ticks, right? So if the username and the confirm password are the same, right, I want to be able to actually go ahead and submit the form, right? So what I need to do is, I do not want to action my submit or my post request in this register user, right? So I want to be able to action my post requests in my app.js. So I want to be able to, because for all my requests, my API requests that I'm going to do them in this app.js folder, which means for the post, for the get, and everything else, I want to do them in this app.react, in this app.js file. So the way I'm going to do it is, we need to pass state up, or we need to draw our state upwards from the child to the parent class, because remember, our register user is being called from the app.js, which is going to act as a parent component. So to achieve that, we achieve it through using props and callback to functions. So we say props.add user, so which means this add user is going to take our user object, right? So which means this add user will be actioned where our ancestor where this register user component is being called from. So in this case, the immediate ancestor of register user is this app.js file. So this is where our add user will be called, right? So let's simply go ahead and register that. So once since we've passed it as a prop using a callback function, which means we need to go back to our register component in app.js and actually go ahead and catch the add user and catch the add user prop, right? And simply say add user. So in this case, it means we are simply going to action this add user inside this file. So okay, so this file is a class, so we don't want a class, so we need to change this into a function. So we're simply going to say const up is equal to, all right, so is equal to this, then we put our arrow function, right? So we put our arrow function here, so which means we no longer need this render, right? So we just need this return, right? So once we've done this, we can simply go ahead and remove this component. It's no longer necessary, right? And we save this up. So once we have caught our prop here, our callback function, the next thing that we need to do is actually go ahead and define the add user function. So the add user function, remember, is taking a user, right? So once we have passed the add user, so let me simply go ahead and log this out. So I'll simply say console.log. So I will say add user callback, add user callback code from let's say app.js. So right now this is how you implement it. So this is how you draw your upwards from child to parent. So you do it using props and callback functions. So let me simply go ahead and save this up, right? So one thing, once I've added the user, this in this function, this is where we are going to implement our post API request to our backend application using REST API, the one that we developed. So after we have done this, the next thing that I probably need to do is to reset our form. So to reset our form, let me simply go ahead and say set user. Remember, we had a set user a hook that we had here. So let's simply go ahead and use our hook set user. Then I simply want to reset the name, email, password. So let me simply go ahead and copy this out, right? So let me simply go ahead and paste this. So this is how you probably go ahead and reset your hooks. So it's we want to reset the name, the surname, the email, the username, the password, and the confirm password. So once you've done this, this is how you probably want to set a user. So if for my validation, if the password doesn't match, let me simply go ahead and console log this out. So I'll simply go ahead and say password, let's say does not match or something. All right, so once I've done this, this is for the most part how you do it. So remember, we can actually go ahead and use destructuring, just like what we did in our composition pattern. So instead of saying props dot add user, right, you can simply go ahead and use destructuring and cut this out, and then you pass it here using the curly brace like this, right? So every time we say props dot something, you can actually go ahead and use destructuring. All right, so once you've done this, the last thing that we probably need to do is to actually go ahead and handle our props in terms of our props data types. So just like what we did in the HTML and etc. In the header class, we want to define our in the header component, we want to define our prop types, right? So for our prop types, let me simply go ahead and define the prop types. So I'm going to say import prop types from prop types, like so. So the prop types that I'm expecting in this case, I'm only expecting a callback function called add user. So let's simply go ahead and declare it here down below here. So I will say register the name of the functional component dot prop types, like so. Then I will quickly go ahead and define my object. So my object is going to have an odd user. Then the prop types is going to be a function, and this one is going to be required. So once I've done that, I've declared and defined my prop types for my app, for my register user. Then for the input row, let's simply go ahead and define our prop types as well. So let's simply go ahead and import the prop types. So let me simply copy this, right? I'll simply go ahead and do it here. So for my prop types, let me do it down below here. So I can say input row dot prop types is equal to, then I would define my prop types. So the prop types that I need in this case, I need the children, which is going to be an array, right? And the children, which is going to be an array, and as well as the label, which is going to be a string. So this children is going to be a node, and this one is going to be a string. So let's simply go ahead and do that. So let's do it below here, right? So we have the children, right? So for the children, I'm expecting a node, be it an input element or anything else. So this is going to be an input element. In this case, it's totally an input element. Then the other one that I need is the label, right? So the label is going to be let's say prop types dot. So this one I can say is required as well. Then I can say for the label prop types dot, so this one is a string, right, for the label, and this one is going to be required as well. So once you have defined your prop types, for the most part, we are done, right? We are done in terms of defining our prop types, right? So let's simply go ahead and test this out. So we go to Google Chrome, and then I will refresh my page, right? So once I've refreshed my page, you can actually see that we have our nice submit button here at the far right, right? So let me simply go ahead and inspect just to make sure that we do not have any errors. So if I go to inspect, as you can see from my console, we no longer have errors. So now I can input the name, I can input the surname, the email, the username, right? Then the password. I will input the password again, right? So if I quickly go ahead and say submit, right? As you can see, once I hit submit, it's now saying add user callback code from app.js. So which means our props, our drilling state upwards is working. Our app.js has been called. So this is how you do it, guys, pretty much. So in the next section, we now want to look at how you can actually go ahead and add your users here down below here. So we're going to add our list of users here. So see you in the next one.